Hello, everybody. This is another episode of Podcast on D-Shot, and I want to do at least one podcast that revolves around my favorite composer, America's March King, John Philip Sousa, and bring somebody on to kind of talk about it. And I'm bringing in the director of the Virginia Grand Military Band, member of the music division at the Library of Congress, and one of the foremost experts on John Philip Sousa. Loras Schissel. First off, Loras, it's an honor to talk to you. Finally, I know your old childhood buddy, Dr. Jim Ripley over at Carthage has been trying to get us to meet at some point. So it's an honor to kind of talk to you.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about John Philip Susa.
Okay, so I'm going to start with kind of maybe talking about our first exposures with the music of John Philip Sousa. For me, my dad was a trombone player in a community band in the Kenosha Racine area. And for me, I guess he played in a group for a long time called the Racine Concert Band that was led by a guy named Del Ice, who had some sort of connection to the Association of Concert Bands at some point, and something to do with the Southern Scroll thing that he was involved with. I don't know if you know Del Ice at all, but Del would always close with Stars and Stripes every single summer concert. So that kind of became my favorite piece growing up. And I think over time it was my only favorite. Well, for a brief time in my life, it was my only favorite piece by Sousa up until maybe I got exposed to the Keith Bryan videotape of the new Sousa band on stage at Wolf Trap. And
sure.
So I just wanted to kind of start things with, what was your kind of first exposures to Sousa's music, and where did your kind of passion for that start?
It's funny because I started in band, not in music, but in band quite late, probably my sophomore year in high school, I think. Okay. But I remember probably being in kindergarten or first grade and hearing in a very small town in Iowa, the high school band. And I think it's so long ago, I think they were rehearsing the high school cadets. And I had no idea who wrote it or anything like that. But I just remember being kind of enthralled with the sound of this music. I think the other piece they played was In the Mood by Glenn Miller, and became a Glenn Miller fan too. But I kind of came to the band world via piano lessons and all that stuff, and started kind of late. But right away, when growing up in Iowa, we had Carl King, so we tended to play a lot of Carl King marches instead of Sousa marches, because for Iowa, that's our March King there. But I always liked the music, and I remember the band director had a wonderful recording, all Sousa marches, played by the Goldman Band, conducted by Richard Franco Goldman. And at that time, there was still quite a few players in Sousa's band, from Sousa's band, who were playing in the Goldman Band. So they were quite authentic, in their interpretations. And I always liked that record a lot. And it was in high school that I contacted Paul Byerly, who was Sousa's biographer, and he said, well, you should talk to these old guys who are still around, who played with Mr. Sousa. So I ended up getting to know maybe 40 or 50 of the former players. And that's where sort of my interest in Sousa's life, and particularly in how he conducted his own music, which is so different than the printed editions that everyone had. And since the Sousa band didn't rehearse a great deal because they were the same players that were engaged year after year, each of the players sort of had their own take on how the clarinet section played the Washington Post. But the trombones had no idea what they were doing, and the cornets didn't have any idea what the trombones were doing. They just played it the way they've always played it. So I started just taking notes and interviewing these people, and finding out that there really was a way that he played his music. Like he said, if everyone's band sounded the way my band does, why are they going to buy a ticket to hear my band? They'll just go hear someone else. So it was a uh, this is sort of a long answer to a short question, but that was sort of my introduction. And then before I even started here at the Library of Congress, Susa's music was already here. But before the music was shipped down from the Susa family home up in New York City, it was stored in 2 large steamer trunks. Now, these are all of his manuscripts, his concert band pieces, but then all of his light operas that he wrote, and literally thousands and thousands of pages of handwritten music manuscripts. And some thieves saw that this house, no one was living in this house in Greenwich Village.
Is this the story about kind of the Entitled March and how that was kind of the story about the thieves dumping the music on the floor?
Yep, they broke into this house, opened up these really fancy steamer trunks, and all that was inside was a bunch of old music. So they dumped the music all out and stole the steamer trunks. So they got away with about $400 worth of steamer trunks and left, millions of dollars worth of Susa manuscripts piled up on the floor. Well, what happened was this scrambled all of this music up together, and the library for years had tried to, piece things together. I was stationed here. I was in the Navy at the time, but on my days off, I would come down and just go through this music and see a page here that was part of his operetta Desiree, or this was the 3rd page of the band score for El Capitan or something, and just started putting these pieces together. Got out of the Navy, and in 1991, the library announced they were having a lot of job openings, and they said, why don't you apply for one of these jobs and we'll actually pay you for what you've been doing for free. So in 1991, I started here. And that stack that was about this tall of unsorted manuscripts, it's down to maybe about 25 or 30 pages now that I still look through and try to determine what they were. But for the most part, we've digitized that music in a lot of other Susa related things that we have here at the library. And those are all up online now, and you can download them and play them, or download them and study them, or look at photos of him, or read about him in his press clipping books and that sort of stuff.
So first section, kind of in terms of some other questions, where do you see Susa in terms of most impactful, I guess, American composers or musicians? I know there's a recording that just came out where Paul Barley was talking to somebody, might have been, was it Harold Spielman or somebody at the Library of Congress, that said that Susa is like the best composer that America's produced. So where do you see Susa among composers and musicians in our country's history?
Well, except for John Williams, there really isn't an American composer, probably of quote unquote concert music, that's as performed as much as Susa is. I'll give you an illustration of how his music has impact all over the world for people. And the story is that the Philadelphia Orchestra, this was probably back in the 1960s, did a tour of China. And one of the pieces that they played at the end of each concert was The Stars and Stripes Forever. And you think for a country like China that had been so closed off from the rest of the world, they had no idea who Susa was. They had no idea what any sort of patriotic, connection this piece had. But it was the same everywhere they went. They played The Stars and Stripes Forever, and people would stand up and start clapping along with the music. The same thing happened to the National Symphony when they went to Russia. No one had any idea who this composer was or what this piece of music was. And the same exact situation took place. And it says something about a composer who can write music that for us sort of represents patriotic, Americana and that sort of stuff. But the music itself has the same impact on someone who has no idea about the patriotic background of it that way. And I think John Williams is the sort of same sort of composer, is that he's a world composer. Everyone in the world has heard John Williams' music, and probably everyone loves it just as much as anyone. But I would certainly put him up there. There was I was talking to someone who was doing an interview with the man who orchestrates Stephen Sondheim's musicals, and Susa's name came up in passing, and this orchestrator said, called Susa a minor genius. And he said he's a lot like Johann Strauss. He does this one thing, for Strauss it's waltzes, for Susa it's marches, but he does it better than anyone else ever has or probably ever will. And that's sort of where I think he sort of that niche that he lives in.
I was gonna ask about biggest impact currently. What do you think Susa's biggest impact currently is?
That the music is played all over the world, and still is. You can't say that about a lot of composers, even great composers. A lot of their music isn't played, and Susa's music is you look at a band concert or an orchestra concert or something like that. Even his operas are sometimes performed, not often, but they still get played. And that says a lot about someone who died in 1932, that their music is alive today as it was back then.
Okay, I thought of this question last night, and I thought it'd be a good question to ask. If Susa was alive today, how do you think he would have adjusted to kind of music in our kind of media age right now? I thought of this because obviously he was such a proponent for live performances. I think he probably would have loved like the live streaming of a concert.
Yeah, people always talk about that he didn't like recorded music. I think a lot of that has to do with the kind of primitive sounds that they had back then. But also, I mean, he was one of the first people. He and Victor Herbert organized ASCAP because the recording industry basically used their composers' music and didn't pay them anything. So the business side of him, didn't like that. But you look, towards the end of the 1920s. When radio was really the great way of getting music out, he was on the radio, every week with his concert band. So I think he was very pro technology in that sense. And he was, his concerts were a mixture of strictly classical music, Berlioz and Wagner and all those composers. Probably a third of the program was that. A third of the program were featured soloists and such, and then the other third of the program was contemporary music that was popular at the time, whether that was George Gershwin or Jerome Kern or Irving Berlin, but also the modern American composers that were alive. Most people heard in the United States here Richard Strauss's tone poems played for the first time, not by a symphony orchestra, but by a concert band. That's how they were introduced to this music. So he was playing music from Wagner's Parsifal in Grand Forks, here, or Keokuk, Iowa, 10 years before it was played at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. So he was progressive in that sense too. He wasn't just playing old fuddy-duddy music for old people.
I wanted to kind of also, I was watching the Captain America First Avenger movie recently, and I wanted to kind of ask you, I was caught a little bit aback by that movie because there's two different, like legitimately they're back-to-back scenes where one scene is like a military like clip thing being played, but of all things, Saber and Spurs is being played in the background, and then shortly after that, Washington Post is being played. But also one of the as we kind of talk about like pop culture references that include Sousa. One of them that kind of sticks in my head is the Water Boy with the scene of Bobby Boucher talking to Coach Klein about getting his manhood back, and in the background is King Cotton. So I guess, what is your favorite kind of pop culture type reference to Sousa or Sousa March being used in a movie or something like that?
I haven't really thought about that. Well, I'm always struck that come Independence Day, every auto dealership in the United States seems to run a commercial that uses the Sousa March as the background. I guess it's not specific, but but that it's considered so American that way that you can use it as a background for something American. And I guess the commercial aspects, particularly now that the music has gone public domain, a lot of it is available, for use that way. But you can hear it at any time of year too, that it's part of the American culture now.
Yeah, that particular movie caught me off guard because of all things to hear is a Susan March that not everybody has heard. And then and obviously with like this past year's inauguration with the Marine Band playing, Jason would be conducting and I would be like, oh, this march is this march is that. And that would be the only thing that I probably paid attention to in the inauguration. I do have some like smaller stories that connect me to Susa. One of them, I kind of wanted to plug an event that I'm trying to hopefully get the fine arts coordinator in Kenosha to get you to guest conduct at some point. As we have a couple events every year. Obviously, we didn't have it this past year with COVID, but I don't know how much you know about like how known Kenosha, Wisconsin is in terms of the music programs.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
But basically, we have Choral Fest, Orchestra Fest. I played in Orchestra Fest like once on trombone, once on tuba, but the big one, or they're both similar events. We also have a jazz festival where they bring in some noteworthy jazz artists. But the one that I always played in was Bandorama, and it's on the gymnasium floor, and it's 5th grade to 12th grade. Ranges in between from 1,600 to 1,800 kids on a gymnasium floor all at once. And they start this concert with like a fanfare piece and then the national anthem with pageantry from the Rambler Band and the Band of the Black Watch, which are two of the in terms of the color guards from those bands. And they bring a guest conductor in every year. Usually it's a composer or it's some college director. Dr. Ripley's done it. I'm going to bring up Laura Schissel at some point during this to talk about a story that involves nobles of the Mystic Shrine, but I don't know how you're going to react to that particular story. But they start with the fanfare and the national anthem, and then they go from basically the stages of a musician from the 5th grade beginner band to the high schools. The 8th grade band, the high school bands get conducted by the guest conductor. They do like one run through, and then on the second run through, and then they close it with Stars and Stripes with a festival version of that. Looking back at that now, I hated the festival arrangement now because of it has that trumpet thing that Susa never wrote. But anyways, when we have Bandorama, I would flip the stand around during the last trio section and play the trombone counter melody by memory. One of the other stories I had is of my 7th and 8th grade band director. And the first time I met her, the question I asked was, "What's your favorite Susa march?" And she says, "I don't have one." And the reason was she was a French horn player. And she tried to get me to listen to other composers like John Cage or Philip Glass. I never gravitated towards that. I think I gravitated more towards some of the recordings that Keith was recording and the Frederick Fennell recordings. And it kind of grew to other composers that those guys had conducted on. But I'm going to transition with the University of Illinois story, even though I would like to talk about the Laura Schissel Nobles of the Mystic Shrine story, but the simple moral of that story is if you're in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and you're playing anything by Susa, do not say that somebody in your audience has not heard something by Susa.
Oh, good.
Because they're playing Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, and she announced it as, "You probably haven't heard the Susa March," and I kind of went and said, "Doubt it," and then we had I outsmarted her in Susa, saying like something about how one of the recordings I had of Nobles is the recording that Susa actually conducted on, and she thought she thought there was 1 or 2 recordings of Susa when really there's just the 6 or 8.
And that march was premiered here in Washington, D.C. at our old baseball stadium, Griffith Stadium. And that was the largest group that he ever conducted. It was about a band of about 6,000 Shriners. And Henry Fillmore's band was there and played for that same event. But that was the biggest ensemble he ever conducted, was here in Washington.
So I'm going to transition, as you kind of talked about Paul Barley before, but I wanted to transition with kind of one of the bigger stories that I have with Susa. So the Racine Concert Band used to hold a artist series where they bring notable guests in. Brian Bowman played with that band on one of them. But one of them was this woman named Patricia Backus, who
I know Pat well.
was like a female Mr. Susa type of thing.
Yep.
And she played
Helen May Butler.
She played Bride the Waves, and then conducted Semper Fidelis. Well, she was talking to my parents and I after the concert, and she said, "You got to go see the University of Illinois Susa archives." So we went. This particular summer was kind of neat because I got to see the new Susa band live, and then later in the summer go to this archives. And I don't know who was there in 2002 at the archives, somebody new, but I impressed her so much with my knowledge of Susa that she gave me a free copy of the Works of John Philip Sousa book.
Oh, yeah.
And then obviously, those file cabinets of music. She allowed me to pick something and get it photocopied. And my biggest regret of it is I didn't choose a complete score of Stars and Stripes, because that would have been cool. But for some reason, I chose the trombone part of Hands Across the Sea.
Oh, okay.
And then she called the University of Illinois band program. We met the directors of that. So I guess the transition to Paul Barley, like, when did that kind of friendship start? How much did you learn about Susa from him? And then how much did it add to that friendship that I think both of you were tuba players?
Well, that's how I first met Paul. I met him, I think I started my sophomore year. I think I was my junior or senior year. I went to a convention of circus musicians called the Windjammers, and then they play and record circus music to preserve it. And seated on my left, I was down at the bottom of the section, was a tall guy from Ohio named Paul Barley. And that's where we first met, was sharing the same music stand. And he had just finished his biography of Henry Fillmore at the time. So we became pen pals, and then became best friends. Paul truly was one of my best friends. We became very close when we were working on the PBS special, If You Knew Susa. And
I have a DVD copy of that.
Oh, good. Yeah, that we worked on that film probably for 2 years, putting that together. And but I've knew Paul super well until the day he died. And actually, as we speak, I'm redoing the works of John Philip Sousa to put in all these new pieces that I discovered here when I was sorting out the music, and other, Paul and I were working on at the time he died. So I'm just finishing that up. So we'll have a new version of that with all new information in it. But no, you can't talk about Sousa at all and not talk about Paul Barley, because here's someone who was not an author, not a musicologist, not anything like that, just someone who was passionately interested. And he kept waiting for someone to write a book on Sousa, and waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally he said, well, I'll just do it myself. So he did that as a hobby, because his full-time job was he was an aeronautical engineer for NASA, stationed there in Columbus, Ohio. And his other job was he was the principal tuba player for decades in the Columbus Symphony there. So that was something he worked on in the evenings, and took his vacations and spent, all his vacation money to go visit Sousa's daughter in Long Island and do all the research. And there would be no way you could have done the biography that Paul did, because all of those people, that he interviewed would be long dead then. So the story, we owe so much of Mr. Sousa's story to Paul Byerly?
I'm gonna add in that I always try to get that If You Knew Sousa DVD, and obviously the movie on Sousa. And now since I got a, a DVD copy of that new Sousa band concert again,
Oh, good.
I try to get all those in on Sousa's birthday. And for a long time, I also tried to listen to as much Sousa on Sousa's birthday as I possibly could. And I think when I was a senior in college, I got through the 14 volumes that were released at the time of Keith's series. And then,
Yep.
but that took forever to
Well,
kind of get through that music.
There were three really good major recording series of Sousa's music. The first one was the U.S. Marine Band under Colonel Jack Klein. Those came out, I think, on 18 albums, and that was the concert music and the marches. And then Leonard Smith recorded all of the quick step marches with the Detroit Concert Band. And then Keith came, and now I think they're on volume 26 or something for the Naxos series. And I
thought it was 23, and that
is it?
Yeah.
There are a few more in the can, because I've worked with Keith on, we published a lot of editions of the Sousa music, and I've known Keith probably as long as I've known Paul Byerly. So we talk almost weekly, and he's one of my best friends. And if you want to hear Sousa in the correct style, you can't do anything better than to go to a new Sousa band concert or listen to Keith's recordings, because they're so wonderful.
So obviously going off of that, kind of just how did that relationship with Keith start, and then how did these kind of arrangements that obviously you guys did together at one point, but now you've done it separately? How did those kind of get to start, and then who specifically from Sousa's band did you guys both talk to to kind of get information on those arrangements?
I got to know Keith via Edmund Wall, who was the concertmaster of the Sousa band, probably the last. I got via Edmund 12 years that they were in existence, and Eddie was a wonderful person, and lived to be a ripe old age. And I talked to him on the phone, and I was asking about, did you do this? Where did you play down an octave? Where did this happen? That sort of stuff. And he said, why don't you talk to Keith Bryan? He's the one, he's been talking to all of us, and he's actually playing this music now. Keith had just retired from Yale University at the time. I was just starting to do these concerts, primarily with symphony orchestras. But that's how I got to know Keith, was through Eddie Wall. And probably, I'm trying to think when we first started publishing, because we worked together when we were at Barnhouse, when they published the initial batch of kind of the top 20 or 25 most popular ones. And we worked on those probably for 12, 15 years, putting those out. And, it wasn't just the editing of the music, but then the huge amount of writing in the front, about the pieces, what sort of percussion instruments were used at the time, modern ways to emulate that sort of sound. And it was a great deal of fun. The only thing why we went separate ways was Frederick Fennell and his wife, Betty Ludwig. Betty was a publisher and owned Ludwig Music, and she was thinking about selling the company. And Frederick said that Betty wouldn't sell unless I would make the switch over from Barnhouse to Ludwig Music to keep an eye on things. And so reluctantly, I went over to Ludwig, but Betty said that she wanted to keep publishing the Sousa marches in the keep it going after Keith and I did. But Keith and I work on stuff together all the time still. So it wasn't a split of any sort. It was really just a business situation. And Keith is almost 90 years old now and still going strong. So
I know we're pushing in Kenosha when obviously the Kenosha Pops and the Racine Concert Band are celebrating their centennials this next year. And the idea that I've thrown out to Craig Gall, who's the musical director of the Kenosha Pops, is to have Keith come down and do some sort of concert with the Kenosha Pops in that style. One of the things that I kind of have been interested in, that you and Keith kind of talk about in terms of Sousa marches, is the foreshadowing. And I can tell it in Stars and Stripes. I can see it absolutely with the obvious example in Ferris to the Fair. My favorite example of the foreshadowing is the Forshey Tower Washington Memorial
Oh,
March,
sure.
where it's
Da, 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 da.
yep, the Woody Woodpecker lick.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask you about, what are some other examples of this foreshadowing?
Oh, it's all through you can see we have so many of his sketches. I think I even have an example of one here. Well, it was here, but usually the last thing that he wrote when he was working on a march would be the introduction. So lots of times these sort of little fragmented things, whether it's a rhythmic thing or a harmonic quote, or all these sort of things, lots of times he finish the march and then write the introduction, or go back and throw out the original introduction that he had written, because these things sort of come out organically. And I don't think he actually actively thought about it. I don't think composers work that way. An example of that is someone went up to Richard Rodgers, the great Broadway composer, and said, do you know, in that song, you take the opening phrase, and when you get to the chorus, it's the same intervals, but it's upside down.
Kind of like Susa, kind of like with Susa with Washington Post and King Cotton, where it's the trios or
da 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 da, that sort of rhythm. And Richard Rodgers said, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't have told me that, because I don't think that way when I compose." I think that's something that very good composers just do naturally that way. But I think also that we have so much of his, almost all of his original manuscripts are here. Just a few at the Marine Band and some at the University of Illinois, but the great majority of them are here, along with just stacks of sketches. And I think there was hardly a day that went by from the time he was probably a teenager until the day he died that he didn't write some sort of music down. So he always had little notebooks in his pocket. And would pull those out and just write little sketches out. 95% of that music he never did anything with. But you can see that he was an incredibly picky composer. Is that he sometimes get through sketching a march, maybe even starting to orchestrate it, and something in his mind said, this isn't as good as I want it to be. And he'd throw it back in the trunk. Now he might come back to that material and rework it. Some marches came very fast. He could compose them in a few days and score them. Other marches took 5 or 6 years. You keep coming back to it and working on it. But he was, like all the great composers, very self-critical and very picky. And so I think that's what you see. Ferris to the Fair is obviously the most, is the most obvious example of what I call self-borrowing, or building on a thematic type thing. But even the rhythm, look at the introduction to Stars and Stripes. Dom, dom, ba-da-bom, that rhythm right there. Yes. Scottish kick, basically. Dom, ba-da-bom, ba-bom, bom. It comes back in the second strain that way.
And there's the thing of the dogfight that Keith explains is backwards. Or that bum,
and also,
bum, bum, bum.
Yeah. And I think that's him. I think that's Susa doing what comes naturally, not always easily, but what comes naturally to a good composer. And he had the same sort of training. His teacher, Mr. Benkert, here in Washington, was trained at the Vienna Conservatory and studied privately with a German composer named Lynn Painter. And we have some of Sousa's, actually Susa used some of Mr. Benkert's textbooks that he used when he was here. And it was the same training at the time that Brahms had gotten and Bruckner had gotten, species counterpoint, through bass, all the kind of meat and potatoes of being a 19th century composer. So it's not a surprise that he was able to set these pieces up and tie them together so well that way too, because that's what good composers do.
I thought I'd add in, it's kind of neat that the foreshadowing thing is something that was present throughout Sousa's compositional life, obviously, because like talk about Ferris the Fair, but then one of them that I had noticed it in is that Northern Pines March, where the part of
Mhm.
the part of the dogfight is right there in the introduction.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And that's an interesting case in point because he worked hard on the Northern Pines. That march did not come easily for him, and there are gobs of started versions, full scores. You know, the orchestral version, and that march did not come easily to him. It's not one of those that just sort of bingo and he wrote it down. He worked a long time on it, and you can tell just from the amount of stuff he threw out from that. And it's a big stack like that. So it was not all, as he might say, inspiration. It was a lot of perspiration too.
So for this next section, I thought we'd talk about maybe favorite Sousa marches or favorite non-Sousa marches or some of his other compositions. But I wanted to get you to kind of react to, I have a little bit of a list of my top 20 or so of Sousa marches, but I'm going
Mhm.
to start with my honorable mentions. So I know you're probably going to be like, oh, why isn't this one on the list, or why isn't that one
Oh.
on the list? But my honorable mentions are Kansas Wildcats, the Daughters of
Mhm.
Texas, Pride of Pittsburgh, Pride of the Wolverines, Globe and Eagle, Sound Off, Corcoran Cadets, Prince Charming. I really like that Homeward Bound march with some of
Mhm.
the stuff in the low brass. The Federal, I'm going to throw in Pet of the Petticoats. I like that one as one of the capo marches. And then I'm going to go from from 20 to 11. I'm going to go Legionnaires, Black Horse Troop, Golden Jubilee, the Chanty Man's March,
Mhm.
the White Rose, La Flor de Sevilla, Atlantic City Pageant, Invincible Eagle, Wisconsin Forward Forever. Obviously, I'm from Wisconsin, so I like that one. Fairs to the Fair. I guess any of those before I get into my top 10 kind of jump out to you.
Well, I, you know, people ask me if I have favorites, and I don't, because if I say, "Oh, Black Horse Troop is my favorite," and then I'll hear "Hail to the Spirit of Liberty," and I'll say, "Oh no, that's a lot better than that." So it changes every day. So I just go with what I say that day. Um, there aren't too many that I don't like. Some of the early ones I don't conduct very much because I don't think they were as good as some of the later ones. But I'm sure I've done all of them at one point or another on a concert, because of my band here in Washington's been going for, I think, 26 years, and I've been conducting in Cleveland for almost the same amount of time. So it's a lot of concerts to play them, and we play four or five at least on every concert. Not just Susa, but a lot of Susa marches that way.
All right. My 10 through the top one, Washington Post. I have the University of Illinois March in my top 10, the Gallant Seventh, the Entitled March, which is obviously one that you found. But I'm going to say something about that one. I think that's the most beautiful trio in any Sousa march.
I'm glad. I like the trio. I always have mixed feelings about that we got that into print because I don't think he was finished with it. But if we wouldn't have, someone else would have. So I'm glad, and I think there are certain parts of it that are really quite spectacular.
The next one is the next two on this list kind of go towards like low brass stuff, and that would be the Glory of the Yankee Navy and the Diplomat.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I had to put Stars and Stripes somewhere, so I put that at number 4. And then Pathfinder of Panama, the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, and then I kind of decided on I think what would be my favorite Sousa march would be the New Mexico march, because it's just written so much differently than the other ones, and then there's all the Native American stuff in it.
Yeah.
And that uniqueness of putting the New Mexico state song in it, just
it's a medley march, kind of a little history of New Mexico in 3.5 minutes.
So I guess any of those surprise you that I would have in that list?
No,
No.
they be on my list too, probably in different orders or something. But each. What's interesting is and I'm a big fan of Henry Fillmore. I'm a big fan of Carl King. Sometimes, you know, you listen to a Carl King march, you can say, oh, that's a wonderful march. It reminds me of this piece or something like that. Each of the Susa marches has a kind of a unique flavor to them. Hail to the Spirit of Liberty isn't anything like the Atlantic City pageant, and it isn't anything like the Washington Post. He kind of reinvented himself. There's certain little things that he did, little rhythmic things, or he surprise chords or something like that that he used. But each of them is kind of special that way, and that, you know, for someone writing in a restrictive form, which is a short form, it has its own form. He reinvents himself every time he puts pen to paper, pretty much, and that's pretty hard to do when you're talking about, you know, a strict form in a short amount of time to get what you need to say said. So I think that's something special about him.
I guess like what are your favorite non-Sousa marches? Because I feel like I'm kind of like the same way that I am with like Sousa marches, where I like a lot of not so known marches. Like if it's Carl Kane, I like Sal's Floto Triumphal. I like the Huntress. I'm trying to think of what are the Fillmore marches.
His Honor, or
Yeah,
you know,
Circus B,
Rolling Thunder.
Yep. I would say in terms of like Evan Franco Goldman, I would say there's a march on one of the Fennell recordings that I really like. That I don't know if there's any other recording out of it. It's the Interlochen Bowl.
Oh,
march.
the Interlochen Bowl.
Yeah, that one.
Oh, sound the call for dear old Interlochen, land of the stately pine. Yep, they sing it in the trio.
Yep. The Illinois march that I think Goldman wrote is a nice one too.
I'm very fond of the Goldman marches. Very fond of them. I play them a lot because the except for On the Mall and Chimes of Liberty, most of the other ones don't get played very much. A dandy is one called Onward Upward, which is a terrific piece. It actually came out of a themes. It was a theme for a radio program he was doing for an oil company. So it was a radio theme, and then he expanded it out. Now, Goldman is a little different from Susa, is that Goldman came up with all these tunes for these things, but he was not able to arrange his own music. So he would employ like M.L. Lake or Eric Leitzen would do the actual band arrangement of it. But Mike Lake or Eric Leitzen could never have written some of these really snappy tunes that Goldman would come up with. But Goldman's very high on my list of favorite composers.
I'd say like in terms of symphonic marches, obviously Walder's Father of Victory, Florentiner. One of my favorite symphonic marches is that Camille Saint-Saëns March Military Francaise.
Yes,
I love
Française. Yep.
I love that piece because there's so much. There's a lot of cool brass stuff in that.
Actually, it's interesting. Susa and Saint-Saëns were good friends and actually met each other at the Panama Pacific Exposition, because that was the exposition kind of celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal. And Saint-Saëns had written a piece called Hail California for this same World's Fair, and Susa had written the Pathfinder of Panama. So they actually, there's a photograph of them together in San Francisco in 1915.
I guess any of the non-march compositions that Susa wrote that you grow really fond of, or I guess.
I like some of I think he was primarily a dance composer. So I like his Gliding Girl Tango. Other pieces, Foxtrot he wrote called Peaches and Cream.
I like With Pleasure Dance Hilarious.
That's a wonderful piece. Yeah. He wrote a lot of dance music. I mean, I think he was primarily a dance. What is a march but a dance? It's one of our oldest dances. That's all.
I think some of the stuff from the suites I end up enjoying, like Mars and Venus. And, we played Flashing Eyes at Andalusia at a Kenosha Pops concert.
Sure.
The band played it. I
The
would
last
say
movement of Impressions at the Movies. I use that a lot on concerts.
balance all
Balance.
instrument
Hmm.
partners. It seems like that piece always seems like at the end, it seems like it's going to go somewhere else.
Yeah. The if you want to hear some of that music, I did a concert with the U.S. Army Band, and it's on YouTube, and I think it's Celebrate Susa or something like that. But they played a lot of the non-march compositions on there. Basically, I worked with the conductor of the Army Band for that, and they're really, really good performances of those type of pieces, like Balance All or The Gliding Girl and those sort of things.
I really also like the Dwellers of the Western World
Mm-hmm.
suite as a whole. I think is one of his best suites.
Yeah.
But also, I the movement I like about from that one is the middle movement, which kind of introduces that Messiah of the Nations
Yeah.
piece. But just the back and forth between it being a little bit light and then being energetic with the bum 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 ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bum 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 that part. So I
Yeah.
think that would be one of them. Jazz America, which is on Keith's series.
Mm-hmm.
I've
It's a
gravitated.
medley. Yeah. He
The
did a lot of those.
humoresque on Look for the Silver Lining has got to be like one of the most interesting ways that you ever ended a piece.
Mm-hmm. That's Klangfarben, that's called, where the melody goes throughout the whole orchestra that way.
Okay. I guess what are your favorite recordings of Sousa's music?
Oh, there's so many of them, many of Keith's. Uh, I like my own recordings of them. I think for style, if you want to hear what a professional band should sound like, with the right instrumentation, cornets playing cornet parts and trumpets playing trumpet parts and the right percussion instruments, all that, it's very hard. And Paul would agree with me, Paul Byerly would agree that the Leonard Smith recordings are really the top drawer recordings, but the Marine Band recordings are excellent. There's a lot of good in Fennell. I like those. Fennell had his own ideas about playing Susa, and they're just as legitimate as anyone else's too. But it's pretty hard to beat the Eastman Wind Ensemble, you know.
I guess the ones I listen to, I listen to Keith series kind of almost every day. The most recent Marine Band series with all the marches being released, I listen to on the regular. Probably not listen to that. I probably listen to that more than the Leonard B. Smith thing, probably because I probably gravitated so much towards like listening to the performance practice side of things. I think one of the other recordings that's recent, I like that Susa Stories recording.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've got that one.
I don't have that one. The reason why I like the Leonard Smith recordings is that they play it in the correct march style.
Okay.
Now, Keith had a lot of different European bands playing on those, and some of that style, which is playing on the short side of the note, you don't play notes long, you don't ta ta ta, that sort of thing. That's if you want to hear stylistically how this music should be played. You can't do any better than Leonard Smith, and also Fennell and the Eastman Wind Ensemble. That way is it's that crisp marcato style. There's nothing sissified about it. Not to say the other recordings are sissified or anything, but it's really the hallmark. And this, Leonard Smith was the last professional concert band here in the United States. That was a all pro. Those were all symphony guys who played with Leonard for years. So they're really, if you want to know how to play any kind of march properly, that I would strongly recommend those recordings.
Is there like what would be your like preference in terms of like playing some of those arrangements that you guys have, or just Sousa in general, and playing it either in an indoor setting or an outdoor setting?
Oh, it works both places. I mean, unless you're what we would call here in Washington doing a pat opener, which is, standing in formation at the White House or something, you might not necessarily do all the waving out of the instruments and things like that. That really is for outdoor sort of playing, but, in a beautiful band shell outside, they work perfectly well doing it the correct way.
I thought one of the last sections here would be just hit on the you're obviously the music, you're part of the music division at the Library of Congress. You kind of hit on part of what I was going to ask in this, with how much Susa is in that live at the Library of Congress. But I wanted to kind of also ask about like some of the other composers that maybe you have the most complete works of in that with the music division.
Oh, that do you have a couple of hours? The Library of Congress is not only the world's largest library, it's the largest collection. It's the largest repository in the history of mankind of human knowledge and creativity. It's enormous. There are 3 large buildings here on Capitol Hill and all sorts of numerous other buildings throughout the Washington, D.C. area here that just store all of it. But as far as the music division is concerned, we have like the complete archive of Leonard Bernstein, and which came in, I think, 2 tractor trailer loads, the complete archive of Aaron Copland, William Schumann, David Diamond. You can talk about old composers, the man who was considered, at the turn of the century, last century, as the greatest American composer was Edward Mcdowell. So his manuscripts are here.
I guess any like more recent composers, is there like any Leroy Anderson there? Is there John Williams?
Part of it is that we're not only a repository of manuscripts, but in this building that I work in here, the Madison building, is the United States Copyright Office. So any music that's copyrighted and submitted or registered for copyright comes here to the library, and then we're sort of parasites. We grab all of that music, and that's part of our collection here. There's a number that's sort of floated around, and it's not even true, but we sort of guess, because we don't really keep track of how much is here, but I'm sure it's upwards of 25 million different kinds of pieces of music here. And it's not just music. We collect for the performing arts. So that would be theater, and that would be dance and all of that sort of stuff. Someone like Stephen Sondheim, his archive will be here at the library someday. But we're working with young composers right now to get their music here too. And one of the things we did during the COVID situation was we started, because composers were writing pieces, for people to play, online to get together. So we started a collection of performing arts materials, whether that's theater or dance or music, of things created around the epidemic that way. So we have a collection of that sort of material, whether it's a ballet troupe doing everything 6 feet apart, or Frank Ticelli redid some of his pieces so that they could be played by small groups, that way for the school situation. Julie Giroux was another composer who has kind of a band following, very popular with the band crowd. So that music is here too. So it's and we have jazz, and we have contemporary, the real most modernistic, far out type of music, along with actually the guy who wrote the musical Alexander Hamilton was down here before we shut down because of the virus, and he was working on a musical that was written by Jonathan Larson, the guy who wrote Rent, and that's going to come out now on Netflix, I think, and it's called Tick Tick Boom. So it's an eclectic mix. I mean, there's stuff here for everyone, and a lot of it's online. Literally millions and millions of pieces of music, photographs, letters, between Copland and Bernstein, whatever, have all been digitized and are up online. Alongside just down the hall, most of the president's papers have been digitized, and so you can look at Abraham Lincoln's correspondence and such. So it's a big place, and we try to do big things.
Okay, I think I was gonna end it with that. Obviously, gotta plug. Kenosha's got to get you to be the guest conductor of Bandorama at some point. I've been talking to Scott Plank or messaged him. I said the two people I would like to see guest conduct that festival are you and Michael Colburn, the former director of the
Oh,
Marine
Mike's a
Band.
good friend of mine.
So,
and he's just down in Indiana, just south of you there. And so, no, I'd love to come because my mom, actually, I'm from Iowa, but my mom just moved from Iowa. She's now a Wisconsin person now. She and my sister are in Prairie du Chien, right on the river there. So it'd be a nice excuse to come see my friends in Wisconsin. And actually, one of my favorite composers and one of my best friends is up in New Glarus there, and that's Larry Dan, who I know a lot of band folks know Larry up there in New Glarus. So, and they have very good beer up there.
mm-hmm. And obviously, if you came and guest conducted, obviously you and Jim Ripley could reconnect as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's nice. I was home in August for my dad's funeral, and it was just nice to be back in the Midwest because that's where my roots are. So.
All right. Thanks, Loras. Thanks. It's good to kind of talk to you about Susa and actually meet you. Thanks for joining me on this episode.
You bet. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks.